Hey, U.S. history. It is Wednesday. I'm rocking out to some 80s music. Bananarama always reminds me of summer. The song is called Cruel Summer, but definitely a song that always reminds me a little bit about summer coming around the corner. So let's get started today. We do have a long lecture. You do want to take notes. You do want to write down the code words for today's lecture. Just a reminder, you have your participation to do for this week. If you didn't get a chance to do last week's participation, you can add your video into this particular participation week and do the response. So double up, maybe make up a couple of points. We'll go down here to Wednesday. We are watching the lecture and notes on the Kennedy years. We're moving into the JFK years. And then we have a short little dice assignment that's going to get you ready for our quiz for next week. So I'm going to lower Bananarama here, and let's get started. All right, so we're going to jump in here. You'll have your lecture video in there, and then you'll also see the homework. But we'll talk about the homework here in a few minutes. So let's go ahead and start our lecture. And it takes a couple of seconds for my internet to get anything processed these days. I don't know if you're having a similar experience, but that's just the story of my life right now. All right, and we're titling these notes the election of 1960, or sorry, we're titling these notes the 60s, the Kennedy years. That's how slow my internet is. The 60s, the Kennedy years. And the first thing that we're going to look at is the election of 1960. Remember, you can pause me, rewind me, do whatever you need to take these notes. All right. Okay, so it's 1960s. We're moving out of the 50s, all right? I didn't go over the unit organizer because we're kind of treating it as one unit. We're getting as far as we can in the 60s. All right. Here are our candidates for the 1960 election. On the left here, we have John F. Kennedy, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And on the right here, we have Richard M. Nixon. And normally I would ask you guys some questions for some animals. The M stands for Milhouse. Richard Milhouse Nixon. Okay. So this was one of the first elections that we can utilize this new invention of the television. And so JFK and Richard Nixon decided to do a televised debate. And I know you guys now are really used to these debates and they're not a big deal, but this was the very first presidential debate that was ever going to happen on television. And it was a huge deal. All right, let's talk about who our candidates are. So we've got JFK. He's 43 years old. A lot of his experience was questioned in politics. See, back then, it was important to have experience in politics because then people knew you understood the law and how the law was enforced. So JFK was considered pretty young. He was only a couple years past the minimum age requirement to be president. And so people questioned, does he have enough experience to be the president of the United States? He had served both in the U.S. House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate, but he was still very young. The other question people had was he was Catholic. We'd never had a Catholic president before. And let's think about this. Why? Well, the fear that people had in the United States back then was the fact that if you had a Catholic president, that the president might possibly feel like he has to answer to the ultimate Catholic authority, which is who? The Pope. So people feared if you have a Catholic president that really it would be the Pope running the United States of America. So that was a strike for some people to not vote against JFK, is for fear that Catholicism would become kind of like the national religion. Of course, that didn't happen, but that was some people's fear of putting JFK into the presidential office. Our other candidate is Richard Milhouse Nixon. Very experienced. If we look at the two candidates, you're looking at largely unexperienced versus very experienced. If you look at this as just the list of some of the things that Richard Nixon had been involved in, and that's, the House of Reps. He was California senator. He had been vice president for Eisenhower. Okay, so lots of experience. All right. Well, the first televised debate happens. And the thing we need to understand is Kennedy understood what media meant. Richard Nixon was a great debater, very smart guy, had a ton of experience, but Kennedy knew that if he could just look the part, look presidential on television, that he would win the American heart. Maybe not the mind, but the American heart. So what does Kennedy do? He hires an acting coach before this debate happens. He hires a makeup technician that puts makeup on him. Nixon didn't do any of that, okay? Because people don't know, about how this all works, live television of a debate. And so when it came to the debate, people that watched the debate on television, they were like, oh, Kennedy won hands down. Because Kennedy, he looked presidential. He didn't look like he was sweaty. Nixon was sweating. He was having to blow his nose here and there. He just looked really out of sort to be on television. Whereas Kennedy, man, one, all the ladies in the United States thought he looked hot, maybe even some of the men. And you can see that Kennedy just had this poise about him. And he just looked the part. People who listened to the radio of the debate said, hands down, Nixon won. So when it came to just the words, it was Nixon. Okay. But television reaches a heck of a lot more people, and they come into your living room and you can see them. And this debate was actually credited for probably why JFK won over Nixon. If we look at this, okay, here was the results of the election of 1960. Electoral college-wise, JFK won by 84 electoral votes, but popular vote-wise, he only won by 119,000 votes, okay? So it was a really close election, especially for back then. All right, so we're going to stop right there. JFK as president, we have some code words. So, third hour, your first code word is bulls. B-U-L-L-S. Bulls. Okay. Sixth hour, your first code word is air. A-I-R. Like what I'm breathing right now, air. Sixth hour. All right, guys, let's continue on. So let's talk about, once JFK is elected, what does he do for our nation? We're going to talk about domestic policy, meaning what is he doing for inside this nation? When we talk about foreign policy, that meaning what he's doing outside of our nation, okay? His policy foreign-wise versus domestic-wise. So let's look at the domestic policy. All right. So JFK, taking after one of his idols, FDR, puts a package of things together that he'd love to get passed through Congress. He calls this legislation the New Frontier, kind of like taking from the idea of the New Deal of FDR's back in the 30s. He calls this his New Frontier. He challenges his cabinet, the people he puts in to help him around him, to solve the nation's problems of poverty, poor housing, aid to schools, and healthcare. Okay, so he says, I'm putting you in these offices to help me run this country and to help solve these problems. The unfortunate thing is JFK couldn't get a lot of this New Frontier legislation, these new laws that would help poverty, help poor housing, help aid to schools, help healthcare, because Congress was not in favor of many of his ideas. All right. So he had a hard time, even though he wanted to make some big changes in our country, he was unable to because Congress was not too keen on his ideas. Civil rights-wise, he wanted to see advancements in the civil rights of African Americans. He appointed, for the first time some of African Americans to positions that had never been filled by African Americans. But he also appointed people who were segregationists, that believed in segregation. He was trying to, I guess you could say, play the middle, or at least see all perspectives. Okay. One of the biggest things that happens during his administration with the civil rights movement is basically the integration of some schools in the South that were not abiding by the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Alabama Governor George Wallace, who was a big segregationist, he made it so that even though the federal law said that Black students could go to the University of Alabama, which was a federally funded university, he blocked them from going in. When that happened, JFK sent down the National Guard, there we go, the National Guard, in order to enforce that he block the University of Alabama from having Black students. Federal marshals were ordered to move in and escort students in to the University of Alabama, desegregating the University of Alabama for the first time. When George Wallace would die later on, I think it was in the 70s, he admitted he was wrong. He admitted that his segregationist ideas were wrong. But up until that point, until he's on his deathbed, he was a segregationist. The South was very angry about integration. There were lots of protests of desegregation. There was even violence, such as the killing of Medgar Evers, who was a civil rights activist, kind of like Martin Luther King, but was doing it in particular in his area of, I believe, Mississippi. So this was something that was very, very difficult to make national law, even though there was federal law. It was hard to enforce things such as Brown versus Board of Education, where schools should be desegregated. In 1963, JFK introduces an act to prohibit segregation in public schools or wherever federal funds are being used. That means any school that receives federal aid or federal money, that they can't have segregated schools. You can only do it if it's a private school, okay? And so JFK introduces this legislation. Unfortunately, nothing really happens with this legislation because Congress didn't pass it through. Congress was filled with a number of segregationists that believed that segregation was the right thing, separate but equal. So Congress kept the bill from being voted on. And the thing that we need to note, though, is that this type of legislation inspired future legislation that would change things up. I posted on your guys' page, this is Hazel Messy. She was the first person to walk into the Alabama schools that were being segregated, and a very brave woman that recently died in the early 2000s. All right, so let's stop right there. Let's go for another code word. Code word number 2, third hour. Your code word, your second code word is going to be Michael, like the name Michael. M-I-C-H-E-A-L. Sorry, A-E-L. I can't spell Michael. M-I-C-H-A-E-L. Sixth hour, your second code word is going to be Phil, like the name Phil. P-H-I-L. All right, guys, let's continue. It wouldn't be until 1964 that civil rights legislation gets passed, but JFK would already have been assassinated. It would be his vice president that takes over, Lyndon Baines Johnson, that would get legislation passed through with the help of men like Martin Luther King, who would soon be assassinated a year later in 1965. JFK would also not see the fruits of his labor. He started during his administration the space program. as you guys learned from your worksheet. He would build a successful space program, but he would actually never get to see the space shuttle going into space successfully. He would be assassinated in 1964. So JFK would be assassinated in 1963. The space launching, the walking on the moon by Neil Armstrong, would take place July 20th, 1969. So it was about 6 years later, that after JFK was assassinated, that we would actually see the first man in space. Remember, Sputnik scared the crap out of us that the USSR beat us into space, but we end up beating the USSR into actually landing something onto the moon. So, and having the first man on the moon. All right. So that would be the domestic policy. Okay, so let's jump to civil rights. Our third subject for the day, civil rights ideology. Okay, so I'm trying to think here. I feel like we're not going into that until Friday, so I'm going to jump back. That went really fast. So we're going to give you your final code words for today. Yeah, that's what we're doing. All right, your final code words for today. For third hour, your code word is 1998. And for 6th hour, your code word is 1991. Okay? All right. Sorry, guys. I knew where I was supposed to stop, but I didn't stop. I just want to keep going. All right. Let's jump to your dice assignment. So if we go right here into our dice assignment, that's going to take a second to load, you'll see at the bottom, here's your code words. Okay. And there is your extra credit. Take a guess at what show Miss Rivera has been binging on. Well, I don't even think this one is on Netflix. I should probably change this. It is not on Netflix. It's on, I believe, regular TV right now. So there's a hint. So there's your code words. Put in what it is that Miss Rivera has been binge watching. Now let's get to the actual assignment. So I once again have some facts and generalizations that need to be made. Okay, this is a skill that many of you guys are needing to work on in order to do well on our quiz next week. So you read each fact, then create a generalization that fits the two facts, but not time, place, or specific people. Some of you are writing such specific things. They're not generalizations. A generalization is a general statement that can fit any time, any person, any place. Okay, so that's kind of what we're doing here. Create a generalization that could apply to any time period or unit of history. So our first one I did as an example. Number 1, in 1965, nearly 70% of African Americans lived in large cities. Many had moved from the South to northern and western cities where there was less discrimination. That's the first fact. The second fact, almost half of all African American families lived in poverty, and the median income of African American family was only 55% of that of the average white family. So I take a look at these two statements and I try to figure out what do they have in common. So I'm going to do a little thinking out loud. Well, they have in common that people, in particular minorities, this is about African Americans, but remember, I don't want to be specific and just say African Americans because it probably can apply to other minorities. In specifically, minorities are having a hard time either finding places to live where they're not discriminated or finding a good income that matches those of their Caucasian counterparts. So I'm going to make a generalization that deals with both of those things, minorities and living and trying to live without discrimination. So let's take a look at my generalization. Inequalities of income and standard of living have always been an issue in society, especially for minorities in the United States of America. Okay. So, is that true for these two statements? Inequalities of income. Yeah, they talk about inequalities of income and the standard of living have always been an issue in society. Has that always been an issue? Yeah, lots of people can't have enough money to make ends meet, and finding a good standard of living and inequalities. But especially for minorities in the United States, does that hold true in 2020? Does that hold true in 1930? Does that hold true in 1960? Yes. So now that's a generalization. Okay. Your job will be to take these two facts for number two and these two facts for number three and write a generalization. Okay. For each of these. So number two will have a generalization. Number three will have a generalization. I will be giving you feedback on these generalizations. Okay. All right, guys. I think that's finally it. Done with our lecture for today. So if you have any questions, please email or send me a remind. But yeah, guys, hope you have a great Wednesday. If you're watching this on Friday, hope you have a great Friday. Whenever you're watching this, have a great day.